I'm live. Hello, YouTube, Facebook, live from my dining room, living room here in Ontario, Canada. Now I'm going live on YouTube. Who knows? Will anyone watch this? I don't think I have any followers right now. I'll share it and see what happens. Anyway, for those who are unaware, if you're in Ontario, no doubt you've heard it. Those not in Ontario, Canada, which is where Toronto is, which is Canada's largest city. We're going into lockdown. It starts December 24th. It hasn't been officially announced, but it's been leaked that starting on December 24th, the province is going to lockdown. Depending on the area you're in, the vast majority of the province, population-wise, is going to be locked down for 28 days, starting on the 24th of December. If you live in northern Ontario, much more sparsely populated, major cities would include North Bay, Sudbury, Sault Ste. Marie, Timmins. They're going to be locked down for 14 days. Not thrilled with this idea. I don't think it's needed. Why are we doing it? Well, in Ontario, we are told that we've got to stop the ever escalating cases. Keep getting more and more cases in Ontario. And the fears that our hospitals will be overwhelmed. Well, this is a province of 14.8 million, so almost 15 million people. We have close to 400 hospitals in this province. Under normal circumstances, Ontario's hospitals are over capacity. We've got more people than we have space for. During the last provincial election just over a year ago, the current governing party, one of their key platform promises was to end hallway medicine. It's because our hospitals were normally over capacity and patients were on gurneys and beds in the hallways, and it was called hallway medicine because hospitals are over capacity. Fortunately, that's not the case now. Our current government, Premier Doug Ford, Progressive Conservative Party of Canada, or rather Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario, not to be confused with the Conservative Party of Canada. Doug Ford promised he would end hallway medicine, and he has succeeded. By and large, haven't heard any stories of Ontario hospitals being over capacity. There's a fear that we could go over capacity, which would mean going back to the way things were normally. Normally, we were over capacity. Now during a global pandemic. These are the current numbers from Province of Ontario's own COVID portal page. We have 875 patients in hospital right now. 261 of those are in ICU, intensive care. And of those in intensive care, 156 are on a ventilator. We were told that best case scenario back in April, very beginning of April, we were going to need 1,300 ICU beds. Never happened, thankfully. The prediction was horribly and wonderfully wrong. We went, we got to about 262, about where we are right now. And the province has ramped up capacity in ICU beds to 1,300 because of that modeling, that projected number that we're going to need. They ramped it up to 1,300. They added 900 beds. This is the problem that we had in Ontario. Our healthcare system is horribly underfunded, so horribly underfunded that for years, there were regular every winter you'd be reading stories about flu season and hospitals being inundated, patients having to be triaged, again, beds in the hallways because hospitals were over capacity. This was the normal state of affairs, especially in large Canadian cities, Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. And now during a global pandemic, it's not happening. We're not straining the healthcare system to the degree that it normally is. And now we're being told that we have to flatten the curve again. Last time it was in March when this first came out. The Imperial College of London published a paper from their coronavirus response team. They said at that time that Canada, in the first year, we were going to have 100 to 200,000 people dying from COVID. 200,000 if we did nothing. 100,000 with so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, or more colloquially, we could call them lockdowns. Distancing, increased hand washing, mask wearing. Talk a bit about masks in a second. It's not working. Case numbers are going crazy in Ontario. They just did 69,000 tests, almost 70,000. 69,412 tests were reported as having been completed in the last 24-hour period. That was reported today on December 20th, so that would have been for the previous 24 hours. And they had 2,316 positive cases in Ontario. Basically, what we're looking at in this province, we've had a little over 1% of the population of Ontario has tested positive for COVID. That's 90. So a lot of people right now are saying, well, I always wear a mask. I keep my distance. I stay in my bubble. I don't interact with anyone outside of my household, and I haven't gotten COVID. So correlation, causation. They say, well, and the reason I haven't is because I followed all the rules. I've done everything proper. But you're simply the same as almost 99% of the population who haven't gotten COVID. And not everyone is hyperventilating over hand washing and keeping distance and wearing masks. So if you read the CDC study, you already know that in the United States, I forget the numbers exactly how many were involved in this study, but they found something in the neighborhood of 77% of the people who were testing positive for COVID in their study group of, I think it was around 1,500 people, 77 or so percent of them said they wore their masks all of the time. And if you included those who said they wore their masks nearly all the time, it was over 80%. So do they work? It's a reasonable question. Hamilton, Ontario, there's a medical school, well, it's a university called McMaster, highly regarded Canadian school for medicine. And they published a study. What they did was they reviewed over 100 years worth of research and randomized trials and experiments done on masking, and they were asked to make a recommendation. After reviewing over 100 years worth of research into masking, this was the best that they could say. They said that while there is no direct evidence that masks do anything to protect either the person wearing them or others, we suggest that the possibility of a modest reduction likely outweighs the potential for harm. If you break that down, parse it out, they're saying, while there's no direct evidence that masks do anything to protect the person wearing them or others, there is no direct evidence that proves definitively, conclusively that masks work. However, based on lower levels of science, comparative studies, and lab type experiments where they measure droplets, they think, well, maybe they could. There's just no proof. Proof comes in a randomized control or a randomized cluster trial. Those are the highest levels of science, and every trial that's ever been done on trying in an attempt to prove that masks protect either the person wearing them or others. Every trial ever done has failed to show a benefit. Doesn't mean there isn't one. They've just failed to prove it at the highest level of science. And that's simple fact. CDC said as much. They did a pooled analysis of over 10 or of 10 randomized control trials. If anyone wants the link, put a comment, I'll post it. But they did to see if they did anything to mitigate viral spread, and they found that there was no statistically significant reduction in this pooled analysis of 10 randomized control trials. Once again, the highest level of science. Now, there are comparative studies and there are experiments that have been done that indicate that, they should work. Think if you, myself, I'm not an epidemiologist, virologist, don't have degrees in infectious disease. I've taken some university level undergraduate science courses, but I'm hardly an expert. But I'm not scientifically illiterate. And when you look at scientific evidence, there are tiers, there are levels. Think of it as a criminal trial. In a criminal trial, you have circumstantial evidence and you have eyewitness testimony. When it comes to comparative analysis or experiments, that's like circumstantial evidence. It has value. There is value there. It's not definitive proof, but it can prove and provide an indication. We think we have evidence that the assailant, we have a footprint. He wears size 10 shoes. We measured his pace and his gait and whatever. And, we estimate he's between 5'10" and 6 foot. That the circumstantial evidence does have value. It's not valueless. A randomized control trial, a randomized cluster trial, is more or less like eyewitness testimony. It's more definitive in terms of proof. So here, in terms of masks, we have circumstantial evidence suggesting that they might work. Okay. But then when it comes to the highest level of science, like an eyewitness account, there's no proof. So regardless, we have masking mandates all over Ontario now. Any indoor public place, you're expected to wear a mask. Sadly, even if you're exempt, there are rules written in, to the public health orders saying that certain individuals, if they suffer from COPD, asthma, cognitive problems, if they're unable to put the mask on, remove it on their own, children under a certain age. But people are so scared of this virus, this deadly virus, that, compassion, our basic humanitarianism has gone out the window. And you're hearing stories about 2-year-olds and their parents being kicked off planes. You're seeing people, being horrible to one another. I saw a horrible video where there's a woman with her children. They weren't wearing masks, and another shopper came by and said, I hope you and your children die. Yeah, just wonderful. But these lockdown measures, we've tried them all over Canada. They haven't worked. The virus keeps spreading around. I don't see any way we can really stop it. The rules certainly make no sense. Costco has 3 fulfillment centers, warehouses, in and around the Toronto's International Airport, Pearson International. And it's been reported in the National Post that those facilities, those 3 facilities, have had over 400 cases, and yet they don't get shut down. Meanwhile, restaurants, bars, fitness centers, gyms, which all the data says are not a driver. They're not driving community spread. They're not driving outbreaks. But regardless, they're being shut down. People are losing their jobs, their businesses. We're going to be locked down for 2 weeks in Northern Ontario, 4 weeks in the rest of the province. And so that means, people are not allowed to go out. Kids aren't going to be going to school until January 11th. That's what they say. In March, they told us that kids weren't going to go to school for 2 weeks. There was going to be a 2-week extension of the March break, and that ended up being all of the rest of March, all of April, all of May, all of June. So the 2 weeks ended up being 3.5 months. Could it happen again? Oh, I'm half expecting it, because all that has to happen is the case count has to keep going higher. I just quoted the number 2,316 today. But in Ontario, we have a chief public officer of health. His name is Dr. David Williams. We have an associate chief medical health officer. Her name is Dr. Barbara Yaffe. And Dr. Yaffe, at a press conference with Premier Doug Ford, told the province of Ontario, a question had been put asking why the province wasn't proactively testing teachers to get ahead of the curve. And if you just go into YouTube, type Dr. Yaffe, Y-A-F-F-E, Ontario, COVID, and then put in 50% false positive, because that's what she said. During the press conference, when asked why we weren't testing teachers proactively here to get ahead of things, her reply was that, if you test someone today, you only know if they're positive today. It's that moment in time line that we've heard many times, and it's reasonable, makes sense. You're just testing on that, and you just know if they're positive on that specific day. But then she added and said, and if you're testing in an area with a low level of COVID, with very little COVID, you're going to get false positives almost half the time. So the person might not have COVID, they might have something else, they might have nothing. That's what she said. This is Ontario's Associate Chief Medical Health Officer, next in line to Dr. David Williams, who's the Chief Medical Health Officer. So 2,316 or 1,150-ish. You judge. In the New York Times, they quoted medical experts with Harvard's School of Public Health. It was the Chan School of Public Health, Harvard University. And they said that the false positive rate could be as high as 90%, depending on the number of amplification cycles being used. You can research this, it's out there. They are doing up to 40 amplification cycles. And according to the Harvard team, anything over 30 and especially over 35, you're going to get lots and lots of false positives, because it could be something as simple as dead viral RNA from an infection that happened years and years and years, or not years, but rather months. Someone could have been infected 6 months ago, has fully recovered, never knew they had COVID. And that's entirely possible. Iceland has scienced the living heck out of COVID. They've tested, the population of Iceland's about 340,000. They've done in and around 400,000 tests. That doesn't mean everyone on the island nation has been tested. Some people have been tested 2, 3, 4, probably 5, even 5 times, maybe more. And there are some individuals who haven't been tested at all, but they science the heck out of it. And by doing extensive testing, and they determined that 43% of their population were completely asymptomatic, and that the big symptoms, the big driver, the symptoms that are most common are simply a dry, non-productive cough, headache, or muscle ache. This is the deadly pathogen that we're shutting down businesses over, but not all. Costco can stay open, Walmart can stay open, Home Depot can stay open. Your local bookstore, the gym, fitness center, small businesses. No. Just big business can stay open, including the airlines. And Canada, you can't go down to the US by car, but you can fly. You want to go to Florida? Lots of snowbirds are going back to Florida. I say, God bless them. If I could, I would too. Might just want to move there. The land of the free and the home of the brave. I grew up in the States. I lived in New Jersey, New York, and Oregon. Spent close to 10 of my first 12 years growing up in the United States. I think I could fit in pretty well. I can still remember the full preamble to the Constitution, and I still know the pledge. Oh, might be in the cards. Because in this country, the way we're reacting to this bug, and that's all I'm calling it, is a bug. Yeah, it can be deadly. Lots of things can be deadly in this world. Swimming can be deadly. Getting on a highway can be deadly. Walking down the street can be deadly. In terms of Iceland, again, quoting from Nature, they found the infection fatality rate for their population was 0.3%, meaning the inverse of an infection fatality rate is the recovery rate. The recovery rate is 99.7. So a little bit worse than flu, but not exponentially worse than the flu. And miraculously now, as everyone's reporting, the flu has somehow disappeared. There's talk of fear of a twindemic. It's completely unfounded because the flu has miraculously disappeared. The joke everyone's making is that, well, they say that because everyone's distancing and washing their hands and wearing masks, that we've effectively almost entirely eliminated the flu. Well, how come COVID cases keep going up? Well, that's because not enough people are washing their hands, distancing, or wearing masks. No logic. It's like no logic to closing all the small businesses while leaving all the big businesses open and allowing people to congregate en masse in Costco and get into a plane into a sealed metal tube with, goodness knows, probably 100 plus other people, 2 bathrooms, recirculating air. That's okay. But go into your local bookstore, go into a small business, sitting down in an establishment, having a coffee or a beer or whatever the case may be, well, that's dangerous. There's no logic to this, and I'm going to go on for just a little bit more because there's one point. It said that those who do not learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And if you don't learn about the mistakes you made in the past, that we're going to make those same mistakes again. And what annoys me is that there's one thing we're not allowed to talk about anymore. In any argument, in any discussion, if anyone brings up Nazi Germany, it's immediately thrown out as, you're going off the deep end, you're going crazy. But it happened. Nazi Germany happened. And while it would be nice to think that anything of that nature ever happening again is an impossibility. Is it? Is it impossible? How was it possible? How did it happen then? I think it's important to understand how it happened then. And that way you can see if there's the potential for it to happen again. I know you're not allowed to talk about this, but I can talk about it regardless. So, Nazi Germany. How did this happen? 1933, Hitler gets elected. Only about 33% of the vote. His was the single largest party. The Nazi Party was the single largest party within the Reichstag, but they did not have a majority. For those unfamiliar with the parliamentary system of democracy, basically what you have is parties. Let's say there is 100 seats in the parliament. The parliament in Germany at that time was called the Reichstag. 100 seats in the parliament. If your party wins 51 seats, you then have a majority position and you can pass whatever legislation you want pretty much unopposed. If, however, no one single party, and Germany had multiple parties. I know in the United States you have basically the Republicans and Democrats, and that's it. You also have Greens and Reformers, but hardly anyone votes for them. So ostensibly, it's a two-party system in the United States. But in Canada and Europe, parliamentary systems are common, and you'll have more than one party. So in Germany, the Nazis had 33%, and they were the single largest minority. But because of that, I forget, I don't know his term, Bismarck appointed Adolf Hitler as the chancellor. He became the de facto ruler of Germany, the highest elected official in the country. And then something important happened. Very shortly after getting elected, within a month or so, there was a fire at the Reichstag, at the Parliament building. It was firebombed. It was burnt. And they knew who did it. I forget the individual's name, but he was convicted. I believe he even confessed, and he was a communist. And communists were bent on the destruction of the German Republic, on the German Reich. They wanted to destroy it. And so, and was that fear founded? It had some validity. Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union, the Politburo, they had active campaigns to undermine democratic countries, the United States, Britain, Germany. The Communist Manifesto was all about a workers' revolution and the establishment of a communist world order. So it wasn't conspiracy theory. These things, this was real. The Soviet Union was not friendly to, free market democratic countries. So taking measures to address that threat in a lot of people's minds was reasonable. And Hitler did that. They brought in what were called either it was the Enabling Act or the Enabling Acts. I forget whether it was singular or plural, but that's basically what it did, is allowed them to restrict people's freedoms, rights, liberties that they were guaranteed under the German Constitution. It was reasonable to remove them because there was a credible threat to the safety and security of the German people. And many people supported it. Not all. Trade unionists weren't necessarily communists. They simply were individuals. I mean, if you know much about unionism, if I'm a worker in a factory and I go to negotiate with my employer, and I'm making $10 an hour and I want to make 12. If I go on my own and say, look, I need to make $12 an hour, 10 isn't enough, my bargaining power is minuscule, and I'll probably, could easily get fired and be out of a job altogether. And so trade unionists, what they did is skilled workers would combine, and then they could negotiate collectively with their employers. And they had some power. They could say, well, if you don't meet our demands of a 20% wage increase, of shortened work week, of mandatory vacation time, whatever they were asking for, if the demands weren't met, then they could withdraw their services and cause harm, damage, financial hardship to the company. Trade unionists aren't really communists. If you read Karl Marx, there's a lot more to communism than that. Trade unionists would negotiate with private enterprise, with industrialists. That was the term at the time. Now we'd say more corporate. That's the word we use nowadays. But back then, the term was industrialists, called these people captains of industry. So trade unionists, they were had a socialistic or a communistic element to them. So they were a threat. And so they could be clamped down on. Of course, we all know what happened with the Jews, how Hitler demonized the Jews as well, how they as well were a threat to the safety and security of the German people. And so the German people, feeling that they were under threat, they were told they were under threat. All they had to do was turn on the news, pick up the newspaper. They're being told constantly that the German way of life, German people were under threat from these outside forces. And so they handed over their rights, their freedoms, their liberties temporarily, just until we can take care of these issues. And they did get them back at one heck of a price to World War II. 10 million, Hitler killed 10 million. It's estimated 10 million people, 6 million of them being Jewish. Another 4 million. The whole idea of eugenics was out. If you don't know much about that, it's basically saving the human race from degradation in the genetic pool by culling out the undesirables. Simply history. Happened. He wasn't the only one. During World War II, the West, the United States, Britain, Canada, the Western nations, the Allies, we aligned ourselves with Joe Stalin, called him Uncle Joe. Well, Uncle Joe, he's credited with killing over 20 million of his own Soviet citizens. Can't happen. Can't happen. I did. And those two, Hitler and Stalin, pale in comparison to Mao Zedong during the Cultural Revolution in China, where it said that Mao killed between 50 and 60 million of his own people. Horrible culling of the population. But it's happened. Now, we're also in a situation now where we're being told that there's a threat. There's a threat to the safety and security and health of Canadians, of Americans, of Europeans, of everyone. And that threat is the coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, the novel coronavirus. And back in March, the Imperial College of London put out a scary report. Their coronavirus response team published a paper, and it was predicting that in a country the size of the United States, that if nothing was done, if the disease was allowed to run rampant through the population, that the deaths would be 2 million plus. And even with what they called non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, or more colloquially, just call them lockdown, that number could be cut in half. It could be reduced to 1 million people, 1 million plus. I forget the number. They only modeled two countries. They modeled the United States and they modeled Great Britain. And they said that other countries, Western countries, could expect commensurate levels of mortality on a per capita basis, which for Canada would have meant in and around 200,000 dead with allowing the disease to run its course, or 100,000 plus with lockdown, NPI, non-pharmaceutical interventions. We're nowhere near that. I don't know what the actual number. I think we're up around 12 or 13,000 now. Interestingly enough, in Canada, the excess mortality, according to Statistics Canada, is basically nil. Prior to this pandemic, Canada was expected to have roughly 300,000 people dying this year. Just call that background normal mortality. People die. In Canada, people die on average, according to Google, at 83.25 years of age. That's male, female combined. People die. 800 plus per day in Canada. Now, some of them are dying of COVID. Overwhelmingly, it keeps being reported over and over and over again that somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of the people dying are in long-term care facilities. I don't know what the situation is like in other countries. I don't know what the situation is even like in other provinces, but in Ontario, we have something called the Ontario Long-Term Care Association, and they published for the year 2019 kind of a snapshot of their residents, people in long-term care. In Ontario, before placing an individual into long-term care, all other avenues, all other aspects of care are exhausted. It's only when everything else has been exhausted, okay, there's nothing else we can do, we have to put them into long-term care because their care needs are so high. People don't like sending loved ones, grandparents, parents into a long-term care facility if they can help it. But quite often, and most often, it's just simply a case that families can't look after their loved ones anymore because their health is so severely deteriorated. And here is a snapshot of 2019. This is what they found. 90% of the residents in Ontario long-term care facilities, 90% had some form of cognitive impairment. 86% of residents needed extensive help with daily activities, what they call the ADLs, or activities of daily living, such as getting out of bed, eating, toileting, bathing, dressing. 80% have neurological diseases. 76% have heart and circulation diseases. 64% have a diagnosis of dementia. 62% have, and I hate this word, musculoskeletal diseases such as arthritis and osteoporosis. 61% take 10 or more prescription medications. 40% are being monitored for an acute medical condition. 21% have experienced a stroke. That's not a healthy population. People do die. No one gets out of here alive. Exponentially worse than someone dying, an 85-year-old in a long-term care facility suffering from dementia, Alzheimer's, and cardiovascular disease, maybe cancer or something. That individual dying versus a 17-year-old who's committed suicide. Both are tragic. But for me, I think for most people, the 17-year-old committing suicide because his entire social network has been removed. He's been taken out of school, taken out of sports, taken out of clubs, taken away from his friends. Think about it. I'm in my 50s. I mean, this is a walk in the park for me. Who cares? You lose a year in your 50s, big deal. Right? 54 is the same as 50. 55 is the same as 54, is the same as 56, 57, 62. Who cares? Right? It's nothing. But when you're 17, 16, your world is just beginning to expand. You're starting to drive. You start, going out with girls or with guys. Or I'm an old school guy. I'm a Christian, but I won't go any further than that because I know how politically correct everyone is nowadays. And I'm not a politically correct guy. I'm not going down that rabbit hole because that'd be another hour-long video, and I'm going to end this in another 7 minutes. I don't want to go on too much more. So I was going on about history, about how the Nazis, over people's fears, over communism, trade unionists, the Jewish conspiracy, how they scared the bejeebers out of the German population. Not all, but enough that they supported these horrible draconian measures that robbed individuals of their personal rights, liberties, and freedoms. Now we have a virus that has people so scared that the government is removing people's liberties, rights, and freedoms. And is it proportionate to the threat? As I said, in Nazi Germany, communism was a threat to the German Republic. Trade unionists, I'm sure, some of them were unfriendly to the German Republic. And I'm certain within the Jewish community, there were likely some individuals who did not, were not friendly to the German interests? You know, was it part of some Jewish conspiracy? Was it part of some trade unionist conspiracy? Was there a massive, major threat from the Politburo in the Soviet Union that warranted taking away people's constitutional rights in Germany? I don't think so. I don't think history says so. Now, to 2020, is there a huge threat from the coronaviruses, SARS-CoV-2, a major health threat? The Imperial College London said that we were going to be seeing in Canada 100 to 200,000 dead, 200 if we did nothing, 100 if we mitigated. We were told it had a fatality rate of 3.5%. Now the science is saying, if you look at Nature magazine, they reported on what Iceland has found, where they've done 400,000 tests on their population of about 340,000 people. And they found the infection fatality rate is 0.3. You can look that up in Nature, just Google Iceland, Nature, COVID, science. And you can read their report, 0.3, 0.3. 99.7% recovery rate. Does it warrant? In Ontario, normally, I mentioned earlier, our hospital system was under severe strain. Now it's not. In Northern Ontario, there are zero COVID patients in hospital. No hospitalization, zero for COVID. But they're shutting down the north for 2 weeks. The rest of us for 28 days, 4 weeks. My area, I'm in a rural area, but in the southern part of the province, not the north. And my area, we've got 25 in my jurisdiction, 25 cases per 100,000 of population. So it's like 0.0025%. So you have 99% chance of not having COVID right now. And most cases of COVID, 99 or 43% are completely asymptomatic. And most cases are either completely asymptomatic or very mild symptoms of headache, dry non-productive cough, muscle aches. Yeah. Should a kid skating on a pond in Calgary be tackled and threatened with a taser by police for being out on the ice skating with his friends outdoors? You know, don't wear a mask. Oh, yeah. Is there proof they work? Definitive proof that they work? But they're required now. Yeah, you can't go have a beer. Can't have someone over to your house. These are scary times. We've been down this road before. McCarthyism came along. Look that one up if you don't know about it. We managed to pull back. We need to pull back again. The people who are out protesting, sometimes they're morons. Sometimes they're the deplorable trailer park, types. Doesn't mean they're wrong. They could very well be right. Just, lettered, having letters after your name, PhD, MA, BA, whatever, doesn't always necessarily mean intelligence. There are idiots standing in front of lecture halls right now, and there are geniuses working on factory floors. Anyway, if anyone has a question or a comment, throw it up there. A little better quality on here than on Facebook, and I need to clean my house. But it doesn't really matter because we're not allowed to have anyone over anyway. Anyway, God bless, and might do this again. We'll see. End stream.